I have seen a great many things over these past few eons. Things which I wish to see and things which I wish to unsee. The dimensions are beginning to shift from an axis of 2 to an axis of 3. The age of the revolution is upon us. Oh, excuse me. What's with the lighting in here? This Dark Fort Lord infestation's getting worse than I thought. Hey guys, and welcome to the second part of our RPG retrospective. I'm your host, SharpZ, who you unfortunately have to deal with for another over-hour-long episode, so yeah, buckle up, here we go. The early 3D era is most of what we're covering today, i.e. the first two generations of 3D, so N64, GameCube, PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, the original Xbox, and the Sega Saturn and Dreamcast. In addition to this, we're also going to cover the Game Boy Advance, and I think that's about it. No point in covering something like the N-Gage. I mean, there might be some great RPGs on it, but I doubt anyone's gonna crucify me for not talking about the N-Gage. So, the early 3D era was perhaps one of the most pivotal areas for RPGs. Three main consoles were released at the beginning of this era: the Nintendo 64, the Sega Saturn, and the PlayStation. The PS1 and the Sega Saturn both used a new technology, something that I would argue is one of the biggest advancements in the history of video games. The compact disc. Yeah, that's right, the same technology that brought you Polka, more ways to listen to Weird Al, and I don't know what you kids are using them for nowadays. Posters? Also ended up bringing you a whole lot of, I guess the best way to put it, advantages. For example, rather than something like a cartridge, which was more expensive to manufacture, and well, cartridges usually have a whole lot more stuff thrown into them. For example, when you hit into the Super Nintendo era, it was pretty much widespread that you would use battery saves. It was also common in stuff like Game Boy or Game Boy Advance, and well, yes, there are issues with that, like it wearing out over time. It definitely also pushed up the cost. And with CDs and DVDs, there were kind of things that happened like that. For example, you could dual layer a disc, but I mean, why do that when you can just throw another disc in for around the same cost? And this is a practice that became fairly common. You see, CDs and DVDs were able to hold video files, audio files, and just generally more stuff than a cartridge was. Discs were cheaper to manufacture and have more space, so it makes sense that despite the fact that discs take a little longer to read than a cartridge, a lot of systems went this direction. Now, let's start talking about the actual games. I know that's what everyone's here for, so where do we start? I think I know. So, the Sega Saturn. It kind of just happened, I guess. This console is one that's kind of infamous for being a failure. However, oddly enough, if you go outside the States, it's a little bit less clear. For example, while here in the States we got, I want to say, only a couple hundred games, over in Japan they got over 1,000. And this is where we run into issues. You know how I mentioned in the last video that there are a couple RPGs I would love to cover and talk about that they were never really localized? Well, welcome to the Sega Saturn. The issue with talking about the stateside releases on the Saturn is a lot of them also came out on the PlayStation, so yeah, where would you expect me to talk about Lunar, on the Saturn or on the PlayStation? And, well, with that being said, there are a few exclusive Saturn games that came out stateside. Panzer Dragoon is the one that pretty much everyone knows, and yeah, this one's good. A lot more of a shmup than an RPG in my opinion, but still very solid. But a lot of the interesting stuff here just stayed overseas. And, well, one of my favorite little ones I found was Princess Crown, this charming little fighting game, beat-em-up RPG mix, but you know what? I'm just gonna say it. When it comes to the Saturn games that were not localized, there's only one that I would say is major. Granted, I wouldn't say that if this game came out in the States, it would save the Saturn. I doubt anything could save the Saturn here in the States, but it might have made at least somewhat of a difference. And that franchise is Sakura Wars, otherwise known in Japan as Sakura Taisen, is a mech strategy game with dating sim mechanics. You know, saying that second part, I'm beginning to see why this never hit the States, but you know what? This series is awesome. I love it. It was one that I had actually dabbled in a little bit before this retrospective, but getting the opportunity to actually go and play these games, whew, they are phenomenal. The Sakura Wars games are always a solid time, and, well, yeah, the first game is just as solid. Sure, there's some stuff that will be improved with the release on the Dreamcast, but you know what? I'm just gonna say it. Sega, this sold like hotcakes in Japan, or whatever the Japanese equivalent is. Why did it never come to the States? Like, I get the whole dating sim thing, but just say it's a friendship mechanic or something like that. Like, seriously, I feel like somebody would have bought it. Then again, this is Sega, and, you know, everything about this console is just cursed. Let's move on to the next system, shall we? I think this is the big one. Alright, I think that's enough talking about the Sega Saturn. I've probably talked more about this console than most people have even thought about it in their entire lifespans. So, let's move on to the winner of this generation. I think we all know where this is going. Yeah, I think we all knew this was the one that was kind of the big one. See, the PlayStation had an amazing library. I don't think anyone's going to argue with that. And RPGs are kind of a big part of that. There's one game that I know everyone wants me to talk about, and you know what? We're just going to go ahead and jump into it. I think pretty much everyone knew from the time I started this series, we had to talk about this game at some point. So, Final Fantasy VII. Why is it titled the final one if they have made 7? Sorry, my sources are telling me that there are 16 now. What do you mean there's also spin-offs? This is ridiculous. Alright, Final Fantasy VII. What do I have to say to ruin my credibility? I am not the biggest Final Fantasy fan overall, however, 7 is still a fairly solid game, but I would like to argue that this game's almost more important for its impact than the game itself. You see, Final Fantasy VII is a system seller. There's no other way to go around it. The Final Fantasy series, up until now, was something that was almost exclusively on Nintendo's platforms, and, well, that adds up, that makes sense. If you were on a Nintendo console, you were mostly irrelevant. So, when the time came for Sony to make their own entrance into the video game industry, the third-party companies really began to notice and went with the optimal CD format. Final Fantasy VII took, like, complete advantage of that, being an adventure that spans multiple discs, uses fairly impressive cinematic cutscenes for the day. Like, I know that for the younger members of the audience, this is not anything impressive, but keep in mind that for the time, yeah, this is crazy, crazy to see on television, especially when all that you've seen maybe 3D gaming wise would be something like Star Fox up until this point. And, well, the other big thing I would like to say about Final Fantasy VII is that it's kind of the entry point for a lot of people with RPGs. I know so many people who aren't even RPG fans who have played and enjoyed Final Fantasy VII, and that's great. And I also know a lot of people who aren't even RPG fans who have played this game. There's a reason why out of every single Final Fantasy title, this is the one that everyone wants to go back to. And, well, I think that's all I really have to say on the Final Fantasy games on the PlayStation.
Hey, you there! I see you. Don't you dare forget about Final Fantasy IX.
Alright, which one of you made the signal for this video broadcast public?
Let me tell you about one of my absolute favorite games in this franchise. This game is a return to the original format of Final Fantasy, which shares a lot more story elements with the games that preceded Final Fantasy VII, rather than having the edgy and hardcore themes of Final Fantasy VII and VIII. Final Fantasy IX returns to this idea of a medieval-like setting with magic incorporated into everyday life. Think of it as a strange alternative version of the medieval ages of human history, but with a lot more magic and the power of steam engines. There's a lot more of a lighthearted feel to both the cast and the world around them, similar to Final Fantasy V, where there's many comedically timed cutscenes, sounds, and animations. On top of this, the world you explore contains many different types of sentient creatures and races, which is an absolutely staggering difference from Final Fantasy VII. The game feels way more whimsically inspired, as opposed to being inspired by the development of machinery and skyscrapers. We don't see the return of the class system from previous games, but that's because for the story to make sense, the characters have to have their respective classes. If Vivi were to be a thief instead of Zidane, his whole story arc would have made absolutely no sense. Overall, Final Fantasy IX is for the type of person who enjoys medieval high fantasy, and oh boy does this game do it well. With everything from thieves to plays to aliens to magic to steam engines to revenge stories to depression to happiness to, well, you get the idea that it's got a little bit of everything. This game is fantastic for its story, and it should never ever be discounted. To me, Final Fantasy IX is the peak of the franchise embracing its whimsical high fantasy origins.
Remind me to get better security on my video feed. But yeah, Muzio is right on this. Final Fantasy IX is also a fairly solid entry. Personally, if I had to pick my favorite out of the three on PlayStation, I would go with 8, but you know what? All of them are solid, so yeah. But what about games that aren't Final Fantasy? Well, we actually have quite a few here. Dear Lord, the PS1 RPG library is solid. I mean, the PS1 library in general is solid. You have games like Chrono Cross, of course, which are follow-ups to other games that Square had made, and staying on Square for a few minutes, Star Ocean got a release stateside, and I would argue, more importantly, Xenogears released. The beginning of the Xeno series. The people who made this went on to found a company called Monolith Soft, whose work we will start to talk about more later. But even outside of that, you have a few more games that released on the console, like Wild Arms, a game made by Sony which is very unique, has kind of this Wild West feeling to it. And look, I just love Wild Arms. There's definitely a growing fan base for this series, and man, these games are good. But another game that released on the PlayStation was Persona, a spin-off of the Shin Megami Tensei series. This was one of the first Shin Megami releases here in the States. However, it was not the first. For that, we have to go to the Nintendo Virtual Boy. This game is actually good, weirdly enough. It's one of the few good games on the Virtual Boy. But that raises the question, Nintendo, what the heck were you thinking this generation? So, Nintendo opted to do something stupid. You know, it was either going to be them or Sega, so, both of them lost. Both of them did something stupid this generation. It's more so a question of who was more stupid. Nintendo decided to go back to cartridges, and well, it definitely did something. There are some games on the N64 that are a little gimped by these cartridges, but if I'm being honest, it's impressive the amount of stuff that they have managed to fit on these things. However, it wasn't necessarily the best for RPGs. I mean, you'd be more likely to get a Sega Saturn port, because at least then they can justify it because, well, it uses CDs. So, similar enough format to the Sony port, and we don't need to make more than one expensive cartridge. Alright, since we probably can get this done in like, just a couple seconds, I'm just gonna shotgun round all of these. You have Paper Mario, which is a solid series, and yeah, I don't really think I need to justify this one. You have Quest 64, a disappointment, and you have Ogre Battle 64. Please, more people play Ogre Battle 64, it's good. I'm not even gonna edit this segment, I'm just gonna leave the audio in, because seriously, it's like 20 seconds, and that gives you a good idea of why the N64 library is not good for this. I just really like the series and wish more people would play it. Like, seriously, if you want a solid RPG series to sink your teeth into, Ogre Battle is a highly recommended series from me. It's just, from what I've played, consistently a solid series. But there was actually something that happened this generation. You see, while Nintendo's home console was kind of in a weird limbo, they had this little brick here which just refused to die. I told you I would talk about it. Look, I'm at your console. I'm almost there. You don't need to break my legs. I get the message. Anyway, yeah, I think we all know where this is going. So, Pokemon released as Green and Red first in Japan, and later came to the States as Red and Blue. Blue being a later release in Japan, which was the superior version. Why am I mentioning this? I don't know. I'm just stalling at this point. Alright, fine, I'll get into the actual game. Pokemon is good? I mean, weirdly enough, I'd always heard from people, oh, the Game Boy entries haven't aged well. You don't have the same conveniences that you have in the other ones. Weirdly enough for me, this one still holds solid. And I think a part of it is the novelty that I'm playing it on something that has less computing power than my graphing calculator. But the other part might be because, well, it's just a charming series. I feel Pokemon is at its best when it kind of is aware that it shouldn't be taken too seriously. Yes, there are definitely serious moments. I mean, this game has Lavender Town, and don't make me talk about Lavender Town. But it's just fun. Like, this game doesn't try to be something it isn't. It doesn't try to be some weird grand adventure. It's just you're a 10-year-old kid going on an adventure. I'm not saying I don't mind when Pokemon dabbles in these other areas, but you know what? For the first games, they did what they needed to do. They were fun, solid adventures that would definitely take me a lot more time if I wasn't trying to just play through them for the sake of this and maybe some other project, I don't know. But, you know what? They're not half bad. Alright, that's all I'm going to talk about with Pokemon for this series. I might mention it here and there, but I'm not going to go in depth anymore because, well, I want to keep this video series moving, and, you know, if we were to talk about every Pokemon release, we would essentially have a series that is half Pokemon, half Final Fantasy, and maybe a couple of Persona games thrown in there. Yeah, we need to get moving. So, I think aside from Pokemon, there's really not much to talk about here. There are the Mario sports games, which released on the Game Boy Color, which are also very solid. I know what some people are thinking those don't look like RPGs. They are, you still have the leveling system, and the reason I made that justification in the last video of saying, a battle system does not necessarily need to be a battle system was mostly because sports RPGs are a thing that exist. I mean, look at something like Golf Story. And there we go. Yeah. But if you thought this generation was about to get crazy, we're about to jump into the next one. Let's get into it, shall we? This was a mistake. You know what? My mood is immediately better. I love the Sega Dreamcast. This console was way ahead of its time, and I know I'm not the only person to say that, but there's just some solid titles on this thing. Despite the fact the console was not breaking any sales records, it definitely has some solid games on it, a lot of which actually did end up coming over here. Of course, you have follow ups to a lot of Sega's prominent franchises. You have something like Phantasy Star Online, which takes the Phantasy Star formula and puts it online, something which was actually becoming a little more common around this era. This was around the time that MMORPGs like World of Warcraft or RuneScape began to pop up, so only makes sense that Sega would try it. Outside of that, you do have a few more games that I think are at least worth mentioning. But there's one that I really want to talk about, so let's take a journey into the skies. If I think about Dreamcast RPGs or just RPGs in general, there's one game to me that just constantly comes back to mind, and that is Skies of Arcadia. Man, this game's just so charming and the setting is so realized to me. I just love this whole, I guess, airship punk would be the technical term, aesthetic. Like, being a skybound swashbuckler is so fun. Look, I would give a genuine critique of this game, but I don't feel like I can. I'm so biased and so in love with this game as a concept, and just I remember getting lost in this game as a kid. This was really one of those RPGs I played that got me to fall in love with the genre. And while I wouldn't exactly say that it was my biggest turning point, it's definitely one that I can easily recommend to people. The cast is great, the just entire concept is so unique, and you know what? Everyone wants to be a pirate at some point, and this is probably one of the most fun ways to do it. Take that, Sea of Thieves. I probably shouldn't say that out loud. I have friends who are fans of that game. Take that, Curse of the Black Pearl on Xbox 360. I don't know if that's an actual game, but if it is, yeah, take that. I love Skies of Arcadia. Like, man, this game is great. And Sega, please, I'm begging you. I know I've said this for a lot of games throughout all these videos I've done, but please re-release this one. Not asking for much, just an entire game. It did get re-releases on a few of the other consoles at the time after the Dreamcast, right? So, yeah, I guess you could technically say that it's not trapped on the Dreamcast, but that doesn't mean I don't want another way to play it. I would love for this game to be readily available. Come on. Eh, you know what? I think it's just making me sad to continue talking about the Dreamcast. Well, regardless of how I feel on the Dreamcast itself, obviously the system didn't sell well. And one game that was released for it that, weirdly enough, I feel could only be released on something like the Dreamcast was Sega Gaga. This game is nothing special when it comes to mechanics or gameplay, but what it is a celebration of Sega. Sega Gaga was an RPG which incorporated a lot of Sega's franchises and was kind of their swan song game for the Dreamcast. And I know that there were still a lot of fan-made games. Heck, there was a remake of a Genesis RPG that actually was released on the Dreamcast and the Wii U. and the Ouya. Why does that game exist? But it's kind of sad. This is the last time we're going to be talking about Sega in this retrospective, and while yes, I know that Sega's failure was ultimately due to a lot of stupid decisions, it is kind of bittersweet to think that this company, which created so many amazing games and managed to rival Nintendo back in the 90s, stooped so low that they had to dip out of the console market around this time. And Sega Gaga is kind of a time capsule of that. Now, let's move on from the Dreamcast. I think I've spent enough time here to feel satisfied. Yeah, the GameCube actually has a decent amount of RPGs. At least partially because Nintendo decided to somewhat fix their disc problem. They gave us mini discs. You know what? At this point, as a Nintendo fan, you just got to take the baby steps you can with them. I know this was nearly 20 years ago, but still. But due to this, we actually have quite a few RPGs to talk about. Of course, there was actually a Final Fantasy game on here, which oddly enough never happened on the N64. You know, I say oddly enough, I think we all know why that didn't happen. But yeah, we got Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, a very fun multiplayer spin-off, which used the GBA link cable. And that game is great if you can get 4 people together. I don't really know how to segue into the next game. So, due to the nature of this being a retrospective, oftentimes it's best practice to cover a single series. And since, well, this is such a massive retrospective, we're only able to cover a few games in depth, I decided to kind of summarize one series with one entry. While Final Fantasy constantly changes and has gotten releases from console to console, another series that's in the same vein and I feel has not gotten as much attention is the Tales series. The Tales series is published by Bandai Namco, and if I remember correctly, it started back on the PlayStation 1, so yeah, of course it would get an entry later. And Tales of Symphonia is regarded by many as one of the greatest entries in the series. This one even got a sequel on a different console, which we will mention later. It's not going to get an in-depth coverage, it's not as good as the first one. But that's actually not an insult, that's just more so a compliment to how great this game is. The art style, as you can see just from this animated intro, is fairly unique, and actually one of the things that remains consistent between the Tales series. There very much seems to be this consistent anime-esque art style, and honestly I love it. And that kind of extends to the cast here too. It feels like a group of childhood friends whenever I go back and replay this game. Just the chemistry between the party is so fun to watch. And when it comes to gameplay, it's actually unique too. See, this game has a 2D system, similar to some of the beat 'em ups that I've mentioned earlier, like Princess Crown. It's a 2D plane where you can move your character around and attack with an actual attack button. But Tales of Symphonia actually feels fairly fleshed out and unique. It's not as, I would say, action-oriented as something like Princess Crown, but it's definitely a game that I can highly recommend to anyone looking to add a good RPG to their GameCube collection. That, and from what I've seen, this one's not too pricey to find, so have at it. Yeah, I absolutely love this game. And it also got a terrible port to modern consoles. Please let the Silent Hill 2 remake be good. Please. But there were a lot more games to talk about. You also have the Baten Kaitos games, which are made by the Xenoblade developers, who, well, in my opinion, really knock it out of the park even when they're not working Xeno. Like, Monolith Soft's work is consistently very solid. And we also have Paper Mario, The Thousand-Year Door. This is another one I need to talk about, isn't it? Paper Mario, or as it's known in Japan, the Mario Storybook series of games, is, well, an RPG series, sometimes. The first two entries are the ones that people often point to and say, yeah, these are the best ones, this is what Paper Mario is, but I don't think even Paper Mario knows what Paper Mario is anymore, so... Not dissing the new entries, just kind of confused. Anyways, let's talk about Thousand Year Door. This game is very much an RPG with Mario in it, and I'm not saying that in a mean way, I'm saying it in the best way possible. See, what I expect when I have any game that has a certain plumber on the cover is that it's going to be a game that I can pick up and get into easily without too much of a barrier to entry, and Paper Mario is no exception. This game's fairly simple compared to a lot of other RPGs, and that's to its benefit. You have inputs that you can use to increase damage, like flicking the stick for the hammer, or pressing A or B to perform certain attacks, so yeah, Paper Mario feels very Mario-esque. It takes something like how Mario Kart takes racing and simplifies it so that you can play it with friends, but does it with the RPG formula. Rather than it being some overly complicated system of numbers to crunch, it's you press this button to jump on someone, you hit this one with the hammer, and well, yeah, it just works. Now, outside of the Italian Plumber, there were a few other Nintendo franchises that came over, but, well, in order to get into all of those, I'm going to talk about the GBA. The Game Boy Advance, of course, got more Pokemon games, which got spin-offs slash companion titles on GameCube. You had stuff like Pokemon Box, but more importantly, the Pokemon Coliseum games, which are... Where? I hear some people love these games, some people are indifferent to them. And then there's me, who already had to play a lot of Pokemon games for the sake of another video I'm working on, so... Not exactly feeling guilty about leaving these two on the chopping block. We actually saw two series receive their first stateside entries here. Advance Wars, which used to just be, I guess, Nintendo's Wars series. I guess the Wars series is the technical title. The first entry was Famicom War, and pretty much every other entry was named after the console it was on. So, yeah, I'm happy we got Advance Wars, though. This one's just really, really charming, and despite the fact that it's a literal war, I mean, look at the reboots, look at the original. You can tell this game is, like, just so cutesy. Look, I just wanted an excuse to show these character models. They're fun. You also have Fire Emblem, a strategy RPG with a permadeath system where, well, you know all those characters who you've been spending time with? Well, what if we just killed them? And now you have to suffer. Unless you're someone who uses save states, in which case, you know, you're kind of ruining the point of the game, but this is completely fair. I've done it before, too. It makes it so much easier to get through some of the older titles. What? I'm not ashamed to admit my shortcomings. But there was one thing I mentioned earlier that we're actually coming back to. So, Camelot. They made the Mario sports games, including the ones on handheld, which were RPGs. They also have their own RPG series. Golden Sun, anyone? Look, I know they also made Mario Power Tennis, but I'm just gonna say it. Golden Sun might be Camelot's magnum opus. This series is, well, it's a full-fledged RPG on the GBA that is really good and we'll probably never see again. Please let it go onto the Game Boy Advance Online, please. But, man, talking about the game itself, this battle system is phenomenal. Like, the sprite work is great. It's Golden Sun. Like, Golden Sun is so unique to me. It's one of those games where I go back to it and I always find myself saying, you know what? I remember why I love this series in the first place. Whether it be due to the just overall charm that you have with the cast here, or the fact that the narrative here is really, really, really good. Like, this is a game that was on the GBA, which I know a lot of handhelds kind of had the stigma of most of these games are for kids, but you know what? This story can get surprisingly deep and dark at times, and I love it for that. Outside of this, there's another game that also can get deep and dark at times, Mother 3, but that never came here. Man, this has been such a recurring theme over this retrospective that I'm even making me sad. Moving on. Yeah, the GBA has a phenomenal library, even outside of RPGs. So I kind of would feel remiss to not talk about it. So I think that covers everything Nintendo related. Next, we just got to cover Sony, right? Why do I feel like I'm forgetting something major? Just when I think I'm about to hit the last console, boom, here comes the Xbox. I know what some of you are thinking, but the Xbox, the original Xbox, come on. There can't be a lot here, right? Well, surprisingly, no, there actually is a fairly decent original Xbox RPG lineup. So, how do we approach the Xbox? Well, a lot of the games on here are ports, specifically from PC. For example, BioWare's lineup, which included the Knights of the Old Republic games, which are very solid experiences, released exclusively on Xbox this generation. You also saw the Elder Scrolls come over onto consoles, and well, outside of that, there's not really too much of note. A lot of the Xbox's library did consist of ports from other consoles, and even though a lot of these versions were superior, I mean, no one really played these on the Xbox compared to the other consoles. When you're talking Silent Hill 2, for example, nobody's talking about that Xbox version, they're talking about the PlayStation version. But I digress. When it comes to games exclusive to the Xbox, at least for me, there's really only one game that stands above the rest, and that would be Fable. See, Fable is kind of this charming little almost Shakespearean adventure, and I don't mean Shakespearean in the epic way, I mean in the Shakespeare's comedy kind of way. This game is melodramatic at times and is very self aware. This series definitely got crazier and crazier as it went on, so that's any indication of where this video series might go next, then yeah, have fun with that. But Fable, for what it is just this little charming RPG adventure that seems to take a lot of cues from Lord of the Rings, which makes sense. This was around the period of time that the Lord of the Rings movies were fairly popular, so taking fantasy and looking at it in a new light, yeah, Fable is interesting. It's fun. It feels very original Xbox. It feels like taking the RPG formula and experimenting with it a little bit to make it feel a little less like a Dungeons and Dragons campaign in some ways, but definitely taking the alignment and throwing it into there. I think after talking about this one, though, we really don't have anything else to talk about on Xbox. I mean, there are more games, that's for sure, but really, there's something I think everyone's expecting me to say. The original Xbox library actually is a lot better than many would give it credit for. There's a good amount of variety here, a lot of ports of games, which are very solid and run better than their PlayStation 2 counterparts. But I think I'm stalling, and everyone knows that. Let's move on to the big one. If there is any console that I always dread when it comes to these retrospectives, it is the PlayStation 2 because there is just so much to talk about, and right here is no exception. The PlayStation 2 at the time of recording this video, is the best-selling console of all time. Granted, it may soon be passed or already have been passed by the Nintendo Switch, which is still selling very well, but the PlayStation 2 just has this charm to its library that I can't really express. It's not the same feeling I get from Nintendo with a lot of their cutesy and charming characters, or the PlayStation 1 with its kind of blocky aesthetic. The PS2 very much feels like the home to almost any kind of game that you can find. So, where do we even start here? Final Fantasy got more games on this thing. You keep saying it's going to be the final one, just like I keep making this same joke. And in my defense, I will stop making this joke when they actually make the Final Fantasy. But speaking of Final Fantasy, they actually did something fairly unique this generation. See, I don't know exactly how this boardroom meeting went down, but I like to imagine them just sitting in an office meeting and thinking, the Final Fantasy games are great and all, people love them, but what can we do to get more people into the series? And they looked over at what Nintendo was doing and said, you know what? Let's just add a stinking rat to it. I don't know what psychopath at Square Enix thought that throwing Disney in with Final Fantasy would be a great idea, but you know what? It ended up being pretty good, actually. See, Kingdom Hearts is a series that on the surface sounds ridiculous and in some ways is ridiculous. I mean, any game that features Winnie the Pooh is an automatic masterpiece. You've seen my YouTube channel, you know that I'm going to think that. But anyway, why does this game feel so unique to me? Aside from the fact that there is Mickey Mouse in this series as a canonical character, I think it's more so the fact this is a perfect entry point RPG. I'm not saying that to say these games are easy. I mean, anyone who has entered a boss fight with Sephiroth will know that me saying that would just be wrong. It's more so because the Kingdom Hearts series is understandable and approachable. There's very few stats to keep track of. The stats that you do have don't go into the triple digits most of the time, so you're not looking at anything too complex. And, well, the fact that it's very much an action game as well as an RPG means that if you are decent at action games, you can compensate for a lack of knowing how to build a party. Not all the time, but at least sometimes. So, in conclusion, what do I think about crossing over Disney and Final Fantasy? Well, I mean, I think it's okay, but I'm still waiting on my Shrek Megami Tensei game. Come on, do it, you cowards. I really, really just want a DreamWorks Persona crossover. Look, if Disney fans can have their fun, let me have my fun. Yeah, I probably should stop talking about Square Enix. I swear that is the last Square Enix game we are talking about in this video. That's not the only set of games they released on this console, but I think we've talked about them enough. So, obviously, Tales of Symphonia was something published by Bandai Namco, but they also published a few games that were fairly solid on the PlayStation. Of course, the most prominent series they have is Tekken, but one trilogy of games to me really summarizes this era for Bandai Namco, oddly enough. And it was made by the Xenoblade devs. Yeah, Monolith's gonna keep coming up in this. And before you get mad at me, they keep making good games. We're talking about Xenosaga. So, Xenosaga. Now, out of the entirety of the Xeno series, this is probably the three entries that I really like, but really wish I could play more of. I haven't gotten as into these three as a lot of other people have, but the one thing I do really like is the cast. I'm going to go ahead and say the Xeno series is my favorite RPG series, or maybe even video game series of all time. So, there's a reason why I'm talking about Xenosaga. I wanted to save Xenoblade for its own video, so here we are. Now, why do I love this game so much? See, Xenosaga has a very different feel from the rest of the series. This game is very, very Space Odyssey, in my opinion. It feels a lot different from something like Xenoblade Chronicles or Xenogears, where the RPG is more grounded. I mean, in like both a metaphorical and literal sense. Like, seriously, you spend most of your time on the ground, and anything aside from maybe Xenoblade Chronicles X, but let's get back to Xenosaga. See, the cast in this game is really fun, especially Cosmos. This character has a pretty decently sized fan base nowadays, and I can see why, and I count myself among them. Cosmos is hilarious. I mean, just listen to some of these lines.
Well, how about introducing yourself?
I am an anti-gnosis humanoid fighting system, serial number 0000000001.
Do you feel sad or anything?
A predetermined set of emotions has been hard-coded into my emotion module to better facilitate interactions with humans. In order to better facilitate a relationship with you, Chief Engineer Shion Uzuki of the Cosmos Project, Vector Industries' first R&D division, I will emit an expression such as sadness only when that response is deemed necessary. However, the emotion module of my program has determined that this is not necessary at this time. Charging our blade! My external appearance is down 5%. Shion, I need to be clean.
Yeah, I really love this series. I'm just not gonna be apologetic about that. Also, compared to the other ones, this one is a lot more over the top and ridiculous. Not to say that the plot isn't great, it's a Monolith soft game. You could literally give them a game about Barney the dinosaur and they probably make a 10 out of 10 masterpiece in my opinion. I really love a lot of their work, and honestly, the opportunity to go back and play some of it really gives me a lot of appreciation for where the Xeno series is today. I'm going to hand it back over to me now. I really could go on for an hour about these games, but I don't think anyone wants to sit here for that in this video. Yeah, I am gonna save my opinions on the rest of the Xeno series for a different video, but Xenosaga I just really wanted to talk about. It feels so different from the rest of the series tonally. Like, honestly, I would argue the Xenoblade games feel more like a follow-up to Xenogears than Xenosaga. And I'm not saying that to diss either game, I'm just saying that because it's kind of just the general feel here. But I think I have time to talk about one more PS2 game. And there's a series which I've touched on a lot and definitely talked on a little bit, but I haven't picked a game from the series to go in depth on yet. So let's go back to Shin Megami Tensei. We actually got the first release of a mainline game here in the States with the release of Nocturne, which was a numbered entry elsewhere. But we also received two Persona entries on this console, Persona 3 and Persona 4. Now, I only have the time to talk in depth about one of these, so hope everyone's ready to come with me to Inaba. You don't get a choice in the matter, you're coming whether you like it or not. So, Persona 4. I know what some of you are thinking. You chose Persona 4, really? And I know a lot of people who are saying that are probably people who entered at Persona 5. See, while the Persona series definitely has grown exponentially over the last few years due to things like Joker's inclusion in Smash Bros., driving a whole new audience to the games, or just the fact that Persona 5 got raving reviews, I will stand by that I think Persona 4 is my favorite entry in the series. See, 3 and 4 were what I would consider to be the first boom in popularity for the Persona series, mainly because these games introduced the style that Persona is known for, this kind of, I guess, very colorful and line-based aesthetic. I mean, Persona 3, 4, and 5 all have blue, yellow, and red respectively as their colors, so there is color theming there. Outside of that, the fact that this game takes place in a small town rather than a bustling metropolis just means that it feels very different from the rest of the games in the series to me. Also, the cast here is just really, really fun. I love the fact that everyone's character arcs take place both within the main story as well as their small little confidant links. And, well, if I'm going to be completely honest, Persona 4 just has this special place in my heart. It's one of the first RPGs that I played all the way through, and it's really stuck with me over the years. Now, the version here you're seeing is Persona 4 Golden on PC, which is probably the best way to play it since Persona 4 finally got a release on practically everything known to man last year. Thankfully, the Persona games are no longer trapped on PlayStation, or in Golden's case, it was trapped on the Vita for the longest time. So I'm very, very happy with where Persona is right now. Granted, the re-release of 3 could have been better, I agree with people on that, but hey, what you gonna do? Yeah, Persona 4 is probably my favorite entry in the entirety of the Shin Megami Tensei series, and I've played a good amount of them for the sake of this video. Look, I played Last Bible on the Game Boy. I don't think that I really need to justify me saying out of what I've played, this one's my favorite. I just kind of find it comforting. And I know that's a weird thing to say about a game like Persona 4, but eh, I just like it. Now, I think that covers everything I wanted to today. So, where does this all leave us? The 3D era was perhaps the biggest change in the history of gaming. And I'm not saying that to sound dramatic, I'm saying that because it's inherently true. See, while the third dimension doesn't seem like a big shift, it very much is. And while for some genres, like platformers, the shift was a little bit hard, for RPGs, it was fairly apparent that from the beginning, it was more so the hardware holding RPGs back than it was the dimension itself. Mainly because RPGs are, at their core, a storytelling tool. And I know that some people are going to say, but I really like the gameplay, and that's fair. You can really like the gameplay of RPGs. I do myself. I love min-maxing, going into variables, and trying to figure out how to make a party that's absolutely broken or fine-tuned for one specific purpose. But the addition of an extra dimension enabled developers to say, hey, rather than our world solely being looked at from the perspective of a top-down game or a side-on game, we can go ahead and make these worlds fully realized. Granted, early on there were limitations, as I said. For example, the Final Fantasy games on PS1 use 2D backgrounds and 3D character models, and Xenogears used 3D backgrounds and 2D character sprites, so it wasn't exactly something that was a full right-away transition, but it definitely was obvious to a lot of people it was happening. Even beyond that, as I mentioned with CDs, with re-releases of games like Chrono Trigger or the older Final Fantasy games, they often included fully animated scenes or better music. And, well, it's kind of indicative of what was about to happen. See, while the early 3D era was very much marked by limitation, by the time the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox came around, a lot of companies had a good idea on how to handle it. One piece of evidence for this is that after this, pretty much every single console had some kind of consistent control scheme. Like, pretty much every mainline console that we have seen since the release of the PlayStation 2 has had the dual sticks. The PlayStation 2's had dual sticks, the GameCube's had dual sticks, the only exception is the Wii, and come on, it is the Wii. The motion controls are the gimmick of that thing. But even then, when they made a Pro Controller for the thing, they added 2 sticks. Now, I'm just gonna go ahead and say it, the next generations we're talking about are very inherently different from the ones we've talked about before. A lot of this is due to the fact that by the time the 360 and the PS3 came out, it became a lot more common for games to be multi-platform. While yes, there are quite a few games I covered in this video that were on multiple platforms, be it on the PS2 and Dreamcast, the GameCube and Dreamcast, the Xbox and the Dreamcast, the Xbox and the PlayStation, or on the GameCube and some other console. By the time we get to the next generation, a lot of games that came out on the 360 also came out on the PS3 and vice versa. Outside of company-developed exclusives, there's not really too much to harp on. But that doesn't mean that this era didn't hold some key changes. See, this enabled developers to make much longer stories out of these RPGs and, well, kind of led it to a distinction. See, there's a distinction that is often made in the RPG community between JRPGs and WRPGs. JRPGs are RPGs that are developed in Japan, and WRPGs are RPGs that are developed in the West. Now, why am I talking about this? Because this era kind of led to that distinction, I feel. See, Japanese RPGs are usually known for focusing a little less on your character customization and a lot more on some strong overarching narrative. For example, if you were to look at something like Xenoblade, you have a lot of customization that you can do with your party, yes, but that character is not built in the same way you would build a character in D&D, going stat by stat. Compare this to something like Fallout or Elder Scrolls, which are very obviously... Oh, hey baby. Which are very obviously Western RPGs, where it's pretty much entirely based on your character, and your protagonist is completely silent and a self-insert, then, yeah, there are inherent differences here. And, well, you can see this specifically in Japanese RPGs, as RPGs like Kingdom Hearts, Final Fantasy. Those very much focused on these long, overarching narratives. However, compare this to other games of the time, particularly those by BioWare on the Xbox, which the Xbox historically has always been more so a state-centered console, then the pattern begins to emerge. Fable, for example, focuses a lot on how you build your character, as does Jade Empire, pretty much anything by BioWare, i.e. Knights of the Old Republic, or later the Dragon Age series. And despite the fact that these might have expansive lore, great narratives in their own right, there very much seems to be a little less of definition when it comes to your character. While yes, there are Japanese RPGs where you can choose more about how your character acts, or the story is a little more backseat, for every RPG I can point to like that, for something like Xenoblade Chronicles X, there's at least 5 or 6 that I can point to that do the opposite. For example, almost every single game that I have played that's a Japanese RPG has set party members. I can't customize my party to the same degree I would in a Western RPG when it comes to cosmetics, or who is in my party. However, those party members tend to be a lot more fleshed out when it comes to the writing, and, well, their interactions tend to be a lot less based solely on what I do as a player. So, I think someone here really wants me to end the video. Hi, baby. Oh, I don't know if I've introduced her yet. This is Blossom. She's a little gremlin who lives in my house. Oh, yeah, she is. Yeah, she's interrupted recording like 5 or 6 times, so I think she wanted to say hi to everyone. Do you want to say hi, Blossom? That's her saying hi, I guess. But with that all being said, I think there's something that I kind of want to go ahead and end on before I go to the closing monologue. So I'll be right back. Her tail was hitting the mic, so I had to kick her off. Anyway, I love you to death, you little rapscallion. I want to go ahead and answer a few questions and make a quick apology. So this video took forever to come out. I am aware of that. And I can give you a few reasons why. Number one, you've probably noticed production quality is up. Like, new microphone, I have lights now, there is a new webcam, that's why the video looks a lot crisper. And to top it all off, I want to go ahead and give everyone a perspective on just how much I had to play. this stack, this stack back here, all of this is stuff that I've had to play just for these two videos. This does not include the HD era. And the thing is, the HD era games, there might not be as much of them, but they are so much longer. The moment you hit the Xbox 360 and PS3, a lot of people begin to pad their games for playtime more. One portion of the stack out. That was the PS1 section, and one Saturn game. I don't own Sakura Wars physically, or Panzer Dragoon physically, because they're way too expensive. And I'm not doing that just for one video. I'm gonna go ahead and talk about the ones I recommend. So, for the last video, we mostly focused on the NES, the SNES, yada yada, so I'm just gonna put all that down there. And I'm going to walk over to here. I guess let's start by going backwards. Let's go backwards from where we started. So, PS1 games can go down here. So, obviously, I guess from just how I was talking, you can tell, and I left the other one over here for some reason. Xenosaga. Just play Xenosaga. It's a good series. It's fun. I think 2 is the weakest out of 1, 2, and 3. And 3 has gotten way up there in price. I think it's like 300 last time I checked. Disc only, too. Like, you are lucky to ever find that game. But I have played these, and I have played 3. Don't ask me how. I love them. I really love the Xeno series. It's just abundantly fun. Let me see here. There is actually one that I'm going to go ahead and talk about that I did not talk about in the video, because I'm going to go ahead and say it. If I cover something in depth, just assume that's a recommendation from me most of the time. That'll just make this section go by quicker. So I have 2. Rogue Galaxy. This one was made by Sony. I have never heard anyone talk about this game. I picked it up, I played it, I really loved it. It has this beautiful cel-shaded art style. And if I remember correctly, I don't remember seeing a loading screen in this. I think it says it on the box. Uh, yeah, see, explore what you see with no load times. Yeah, it's very impressive for PS2. And then Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne. This is the first mainline Shin Megami Tensei released in the States. There was an HD remaster re-released that I think was more so released so they could say, oh, Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne has been ported to something modern, rather than, hey, let's port this game out of love. Because Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne is not that expensive. I would say, like, with the RPGs that I have bought, the ones that I've found have been the most expensive to get my hands on have been the ones on the GameCube. I was lucky with both Tales of Symphonia and um, Phantasy Star in that I picked both of these up right before the price hikes. So these are both very good games too. Crystal Chronicles I talked about briefly. Um, the Final Fantasy games on PlayStation, I have a soft spot for Final Fantasy 12. I know that might just be me, but I personally just have always had a soft spot for that game. Kingdom Hearts is obviously good. I think the ones I said I would recommend, the GBA version is probably my favorite. When it comes to pure aesthetics, Birth by Sleep, I actually have not fully completed as of the writing of this script, but I have played through, I want to say about 2/3 of it. I'm on the last storyline, and I can tell you right now, play Kingdom Hearts like 2 at least first, and it's phenomenal. Also, I know I talked about Persona 4. Persona 3 FES is also really good. Just the Persona games in general, you're going to consistently have a fun uh experience with those. So going back one generation, I think I already said the ones I recommend, like Jade Empire and Fable. Um, oh, For the GameCube, one I do not own, but I highly recommend because it's getting a re-release. Baten Kaitos. That one's also by Monolith, and you've heard my opinions on Monolith in this video. It's phenomenal. Uh, We also have the Game Boy, which I covered for the sake of this. Now, three of these are imports. Dragon Quest Monsters. I think this got a stateside release as a Dragon Warriors game. I'm gonna edit that out. This got a release as a Dragon Warriors game, I think, here in the States, because that was the title they went under for the longest time. I briefly mentioned this one. How do I... Mario Tennis. Just the Mario Sports RPGs on handhelds are always consistently great. Um, I'm not talking about the 3DS entries, and I think the DS did not have a single RPG style Mario Sports entry, but those are all phenomenal. All right, shut up, you stupid idiot. It's time to get back to the actual video. I am in charge now. I am the editor. I have permission to do this, and you do not. Yeah, it's ridiculous. Like, this stack behind me, that's just for the first two videos, and that's just the stuff I own physically. And I think, yeah, I forgot to put the GBA Kingdom Hearts on there too. So it's like, even with all that's on there, I have not put like every single game up there, and it's still a ridiculous stack. I want to say I looked at like the statistics at the end of the last video, and I was planning on around 150 games being mentioned or talked about or just covered in the series. And at this point, you can probably tell with this one, I focused a lot less on quantity and a lot more on quality. Because I'm going to be honest with you, there are so many games that you need to cover in these kind of series, and you only have so much time to go through them. Because I could just make two-hour long videos going over, like, pretty much every game I feel is worth covering. But I'm not going to have fun with that, and I doubt anyone else would either. So. Anyway, until next time, guys, this is Sharp. Did you say something? I'm not getting a break, am I? Before we end today's episode, I just want to go ahead and give a special thanks to Muzio. Go ahead and take it away.
Hey y'all, thank you so much for watching the video. Sharp worked very hard on it, and I'm glad that y'all sat around through my rant about Final Fantasy IX and how it is amazing. Anyways, my channel is twitch.tv/Muzio, MUZI0H. Same with my YouTube channel. I don't really put stuff on there, low-key, but I do stream on Twitch, so there is that. You can also follow me on Twitter at itsmuzio, spelled the same way. And without further ado, I'll pass this back over to Sharp.
And that's a wrap. Dear Lord, this video took way too long to make, and I want to again say thank you to everyone for being patient on this. This video I think turned out really good. I want to say it's one of the videos on my channel that I'm really, really proud of. Um, anyway, s- uh, if this is your first video of mine that you have seen, hi, I'm SharpZ. I usually do videos about gaming history or game design, and most of the time they do range in this time span. This is actually part two of a um part right now going to be three-part series on the history of RPGs. That first part I think is okay, but this one took a whole lot longer to come out um, for a lot of reasons I got into for a bit. But anyway, um, I am really, really excited for what I have planned for the future for this channel. So if you really want to see that, number one, subscribing is the best way to see that, and there's a little bell notification thing. Usually, I know people are tired of hearing that, but hey, I'm just gonna say it so that the Pikachu Dark Lord will not shoot me. Anyway, until next time, guys, this is Sharp Z signing off.